Hello, students, and welcome back to Political Sociology. We are in week 8 already. Semester is moving along very quickly. I hope you're doing your best to keep up. I have set up a different office hour system. If you need to contact me or you would like to meet with me, take advantage of that. It allows you to make an appointment rather than just show up during the 2-hour block. This week, we are going to focus on probably one of the most significant areas, and that is, broadly speaking, political economy. Now, because I love political economy has been embedded and dispersed and integrated in this entire course, but today we're going to get at the heart of it, which is the relationship between capitalism and democracy. Political, democracy, economy, capitalism. So this is at the heart of political economy, the relationship between capitalism and democracy, between the economy and the polity. And in the United States, in terms of the ideology, there is a quaint belief that capitalism and democracy are mutually reinforcing, that you can't have one without the other, that capitalism gives rise to democracy and democracy gives rise to capitalism. This is, in fact, utterly false. In fact, capitalism and democracy are in constant tension with one another. And many of the crises and contradictions of capitalism, of a capitalist system, are a result of this tension. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about the relationship between the capacity to consume, the capacity to produce, and how the tension between those two give rise to supply-side economic crises or demand-side economic crises, depending on which of those two capacities is most advanced and which is least strenuous in terms of promoting its interests. Okay, so capitalism and democracy, that is the theme. You've had 2 readings, one by Eric Owen Wright. If you remember Eric Owen Wright, we discussed his work earlier in the semester on contradictory class locations. Eric Owen Wright left us about a year ago. Unexpectedly, he developed some kind of a terminal illness, a great loss, one of the most significant contributors to Marxist sociology. I would encourage you to read his works, and I have shared one with you this week on the relationship between capitalism and democracy in the context of the principle, the philosophical principle of freedom. The other piece is by Merkel, and that gets at the political economy side in a way that is very important to understand if you're going to make any sense of what's happening in our society, both historically and currently. All right, so let's get started. I just want to touch on a few democratic theories that have been discussed in the context of political sociology. One is what's called democratic elitism, and that may sound a little contradictory or like an oxymoron. Democracy is, demos is the people, and elitism is a concentration of power. And this was a theory that was developed back in the 1960s. And the idea was essentially that the vitality and survival of democracy depended on relying upon, depending upon, and trusting elites. There had been some survey data that had been done back in the 1950s and the 1960s on people's attitudes towards certain kinds of constitutional rights. And some of the results were a little troubling. Large percentages of people did not express a full support for sort of basic liberal constitutional democratic rights. And from this, some people decided that the political system had to be protected from the people. And we hear about this all the time. We talked a little bit about populism, right? Had to be protected from the people, and that we had to trust the elites to ensure that democracy would be safe, would be preserved. And so the whole thrust of democratic elitism is essentially that, if people don't participate in the political system, if there's low levels of turnout, if there's low levels of political activism, that's actually a good thing because the masses, and there's this sort of distinction between elite and mass, the masses cannot be trusted. They don't hold the same values. They haven't been socialized into the necessary principles of liberal democracy. And therefore, we have to entrust the political system in the hands of a small number of elites who obviously possess the skills, the knowledge, and the perspective to ensure that democracy is safe. So this was a kind of odd theory of democracy. It's odd because historically, it's the masses that should be suspicious of the elite, and not the elite that should be suspicious of the masses, and that you can trust the elite to do something. That is, we constantly need to be on our guard, and things need to be transparent so we know what the elite are doing, because they cannot be trusted. So this idea of democratic elitism turned democratic theory, at least classical democratic theory, on its head, and concluded that democracy was safer if the people, the masses is what they called them, okay, and that term is significant when you talk about the citizenry as a mass, should be constrained and should not be encouraged to participate. Because if they participate in large numbers, who knows what kind of thing they're going to support? Who knows what kind of candidate they're going to support? They might support an extremist. They might support a demagogue. And therefore, let's leave democracy in the hands of the elite. A very strange theory. Now, since then, there have been countless critiques of this theoretical perspective. One of the most sustained, powerful critiques was in a book by Bachrach and Baratz. We discussed their work early in the semester when they talked about the two faces of power. They do a devastating critique of democratic elitism on a number of dimensions, critical dimensions, on which the theory ultimately rests. So that's democratic elitism. This still is a significant aspect of the way many people think about the democratic polity. That somehow the elite are the ones that know best what is in the interest of the masses, and better to leave things to them than to mobilize large numbers of the citizenry. Okay, so that's democratic elitism. Economic theory of democracy is something that was developed by Anthony Downs, and basically he takes the concept of the market and essentially uses that as a metaphor for the democratic political system. And so voters are basically customers, and the candidates are selling themselves. And this gives rise to a theory we talked about earlier in the semester, the median voter theorem. And that is, if you want the greatest number of customers, if you're a political party, then you aim for that center of the normal distribution where the majority of voters presumably reside. Now, I provided a critique of that, and one of the best critiques of the median voter theorem is the investment theory of politics. It's much more accurate in describing what is happening, and I've made reference to that repeatedly. So the economic theory of democracy is basically, democracy is fine as long as you have a choice. Just like when you go to the supermarket, if you have a choice, right? Consumer sovereignty, voter sovereignty. And so the choice of candidates, the choice that are brought before us by the political parties, similar to the kinds of choices one makes in a marketplace. There are lots of theories that have been developed where you take the logic of the market and you apply it to particular other aspects of social relations, other social institutions, and this is just another example. But it's a very, very significant theory of democracy. It was a more significant theory of democracy. I think to a large extent, just like democratic elitism, it has largely been challenged, critiqued, and I think its influence is significantly minimized. So that's the economic theory of democracy. Anthony Downs, so if you're interested in reading more about that. It's an interesting theory, and it's always interesting to see how somebody can take a conceptual apparatus from the economic side and apply it to the political side. So, it was a creative theory, and there are certain aspects of it that are probably relevant in terms of strategies that candidates pursue, but generally other theories have essentially displaced it as a significant way to understand what happens in a democratic system. Now, a couple other ways to think about democracy. One is the participatory theory of democracy. And this is a broad kind of classical theory of democracy, what democracy means, how we actually know whether it exists. And it holds a very high threshold in terms of what constitutes democratic practice. And the participatory theory of democracy, the basic idea is that if any decision is made that impacts you individually, you should have some role in that decision-making process. You understand? Participatory theory of democracy. All people who are affected by decisions should be able to participate in their creation and the deliberation process that produces certain kinds of decisions. One place where this has been applied in a significant way as a kind of political movement is in the workplace. In other words, if you are hired in a firm or an organization or a business or an establishment, the decisions that are made by the owners often have a direct impact on your daily life, not only in the workplace, but in terms of the kinds of benefits you have, how much money you make, your ability to survive. So those decisions are made by a small number of people, but they affect large numbers. The large numbers are not in any way consulted about those decisions. So a participatory theory of democracy would argue that people should have much more input, participation, control, and influence over decisions made in the workplace because those decisions affect them. So that's a participatory theory of democracy. And we don't really apply this in many institutions at all. Think about educational institutions. I make all kinds of decisions as a faculty member, and the university makes all kinds of decisions as an institution that affect you. But you are not directly involved in the process of establishing the policies and the procedures and the decisions which affect you. So we don't practice participatory democracy in many spheres at all in our life. And this is something that Eric Owen Wright highlights in his piece. Now, related to this is the developmental theory of democracy. And that is, if you want Democrats, small d, people who value and are active and are participatory in a democratic system, you have to develop their democratic skills. And to develop their democratic skills, that means that people need to participate. So the participatory theory of democracy actually is closely related to the developmental theory, because if people have the opportunity at the earliest stages to participate in making decisions that affect them in various institutions and various organizations, they develop an appreciation, an understanding, and the skills necessary to be effective democratic citizens. So these are what we might call certain kinds of principles of democracy that we should aspire to. And we should think more about this. So if we find that many people in the country do not necessarily have the kinds of democratic values and democratic skills we think they should have, we have to ask ourselves why. As sociologists, we don't assume that people are naturally or inherently this or that. Those skills, those orientations, those dispositions are shaped by their experiences. And if most of your experiences are in undemocratic institutions, it's hard to understand why somebody would expect people to have the kinds of democratic skills and values and dispositions that presumably support, sustain the vitality of a democratic parliament. So we would need to restructure our institutions. The implications of these theories are radical. You would have to restructure the basic fundamental organization of institutions in order to develop and allow for the participation of individuals that are subject to decisions in any institutional organizational setting. Okay, now let's get to one of my favorite. Let's see if I can move myself. I'm going to move myself over here. Okay. I don't know if you can see that. Right. It was blocking the slides. All right. One of the greatest books I've ever read. And, sometimes people ask me, they say, what's the best book you've ever read? Or what's your favorite song? Or what's your favorite album? Or what's the best novel? And I don't like those kind of questions because often it's, sometimes it's the last one I read because I just enjoyed it so much. I can't remember all. But in this case, I can actually answer this question somewhat by saying this is one of the most significant books I have read significant in terms of shaping my understanding of the political economic system and providing me with a framework that allows me to analyze a whole range of political issues, political debates. And I have written several papers which utilize the conceptual apparatus presented by Bowles and Gintis. Now, a little bit about Bowles and Gintis briefly. Sam Bowles and Herbert Gintis, two Marxist economists that were at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I got my PhD in sociology. They were over in the economics department. But as a graduate student, I was able to sit in on their courses. It was a wonderful experience. And they have written many books together. One of the most famous, one of the first books I read, was Schooling in Capitalist Society, Schooling in Capitalist America. It was one of the first radical Marxist analyses of schooling and education. They've gone on to write many other things, and in some ways they've both gone in kind of separate directions later in their life. But this book is a remarkable contribution to understanding the tension, and this is the point of the tension between democracy and capitalism. And they do this by pointing out that capitalism is based on property ownership. Your influence, your ability to engage in the economy, which is capitalist, depends to a very large extent on how much property you have, how much income you have, how much wealth you have. Decisions made in the capitalist marketplace are driven by property ownership, income, and wealth. And capitalism is based on, ultimately, property rights. Property rights enforced, by the way, by the state. So when we talk about a free market, there's no such thing as a free market. Capitalism can't operate if the state does not protect people's property rights as sacred. And I think we talked about this in an earlier episode, this idea that somehow property is equivalent to property rights are equivalent to human rights, right? So people talk about violence as breaking a window during a protest, when we know there's a difference between breaking a window and smashing somebody's head with a baton, right? Okay, so on the one hand, capitalism is based on property rights, and the amount of property you have pretty much determines how much influence and power you will have within the economic system. Democracy is based on citizenship rights. Every citizen has the right to participate politically in decision-making in a democracy. So right off the bat, you have this tension between property rights, citizenship rights. Okay? And what Bowles and Gintis argue is that to understand what happens politically, it's constantly the clash of rights. Now, capitalism and property rights associated with the capitalist class. Democracy, citizenship rights associated with the working class, with the majority of the population. When we talked about the theories of the state, we talked about the instrumental theory, we talked about the capital domination theory, and we talked about the, there were different terms for it, but basically class conflict theory. And I mentioned that Bowles and Gintis were theorists who subscribed to the class conflict. And it's based on this clash, okay? This clash of rights. Let me give a very simple example here. One simple example of the clash of rights. And there's different ways to take this conceptual apparatus and apply it in different settings. Actually, this is one example they give in the book. Somebody owns a restaurant. That's that person's property. As that person's property, they have the right to do with their property what they want. That means they could essentially say, I only want certain kinds of people to be allowed to eat in my restaurant. I only want white people to eat in my restaurant. I don't want black people to eat in my restaurant. That's the exercise of property rights. It's my property. I should be able to decide. That clashes with citizenship rights. The rights of all citizens to be able to freely go from one public setting to another public setting, right? We talk about public accommodations. We talk about public accommodations in places that are often privately owned. You see the tension here, right? When you had the lunch counter sit-in, it was essentially a clash between I'm a citizen of this country and I have the right to eat wherever the hell I want. And on the other hand, the owner saying, I own this place. It's my property. I should be able to decide. Understand? Now, here's another way to think about it, in an entirely different kind of setting. We talk about this debate over healthcare, what kind of healthcare system we should have. A property rights healthcare system is essentially you get the healthcare that you pay for in the market. Okay, so think about capitalism, property, market, all of these things go together. And so you access healthcare in a marketplace. And the amount of healthcare you get depends on how much income, wealth you have. An alternative way to think about it is that healthcare is as we often say, many people have said it, a human right. All citizens have a right to access to the healthcare they need to keep themselves healthy and alive as human beings. Again, the clash between property rights and citizenship rights. Property rights are unequally distributed. They're exclusionary. Some people have more property than others, and that translates into power and influence and domination. Citizenship rights, presumably, are possessed by everyone. Everyone is a citizen. Earlier in the semester, I think we talked about, when we think about citizenship rights, one person, one vote. The power of numbers, right? You think about property rights, you think about $1, one vote. Which of those prevails in the American political system? To ask that question is to answer it in this political sociology class, as you know. Okay, so this fundamental division: democracy, citizenship rights; capitalism, property rights. Constant, fundamental clash, conflict, tension, contradiction, battles, struggle. After all, they're Marxists. It's about class struggle. All right. Getting excited. Okay, so here is a diagram I put together. I know there's a lot here. It looks complicated, but this is something I like to do. And I would actually encourage you to think about doing this sort of thing. Let me see if I can move my screen, because even though you can see everything, I'm not sure I can. Okay. Can you read something which has many parts and pieces and concepts within a larger theoretical framework? And can you reduce what you read, which is often dense and difficult to get through, in a causal, what I'll call a causal diagram? A diagram where at least you're identifying the relationship between concepts. Sometimes you'll take a class and you'll do something called concept mapping. What's the relationship between concepts? So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a little bit of Bowles and Gintis, and I'm taking a little bit of James O'Connor from The Fiscal Crisis of the State. And you can see some of the terminology there: accumulation function, legitimation function. But from Bowles and Gintis, property rights and citizenship rights. And I'm expanding this out to talk a little bit about some of the crises we've seen and we've discussed in this class. So again, how do we take concepts? How do we take theoretical frameworks? How do we take conceptual apparatus and use it to formulate some kind of model, some kind of narrative, some kind of understanding of what's going on? And that's what I'm doing here. So the big, what we might call the master dichotomy, if you like, is between capitalism and democracy. And I'm actually writing a paper that's focusing on all of the critical dichotomies that are fundamental to political economy. And at the highest level, it's capitalism, democracy, right? And then it's, okay, what does that mean? The polity in the economy. What happens in the political system? What happens in the economic system? If you do political economy, you know that these things are not separate. They're fundamentally connected in important ways. If you go over to the business school, you take an economics course, they make it sound like the economy is an entirely separate thing. It's not political. The market decides, and that's the ideology over there. The reality is all economies are political, and all political systems are shaped by the economy. We talked about this at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about the interdisciplinary, interconnected nature of institutional spheres. When I say institutional, the political system and the economic system, and then the social aspect as well. Okay, so in the economy, you have capitalist production. It's based on property rights, the ownership of the means of production by capitalists. They decide, they make the decisions. Over on the other side, you have this idea of liberal democracy, where you have citizenship rights. Another way of thinking about the conflict in politics that we constantly see, not just in the United States, but in almost every other country, is the relationship between market justice and social justice. Market justice is let the market decide. The market is the best arbiter to decide how goods should be distributed. Think about the healthcare system. Market justice. You get the healthcare you can pay for. That's market justice, right? Social justice, derived out of citizenship rights. Okay? Property rights, capitalist class; market justice, citizenship rights, working class; social justice. If you live in a just society, that society should provide you with basic fundamental needs, should meet your needs as a citizen. So let's think about those two functions that O'Connor talked about in the fiscal crisis of the state. And notice, and this is a key point, workers organize and they're trying to get something to protect them from the market. And they lobby the state, okay? They make demands upon the state. They organize to try to get the government and the state to respond to their needs. And the capitalists do the same thing. Cut taxes, get rid of regulations, smash unions, reduce welfare, right? So on the one hand, you have the legitimation function. We talked about that, legitimation function, which often involves the social welfare state and what Bowles and Gintis and others sometimes call the social wage or the citizen's wage. What does that mean? It means that as a citizen, you're entitled to receive benefits independent of working. That's what a social wage is. Unemployment insurance is a form of the social wage. That's a significant one in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Over on the other side, market justice, the pressure of the capitalist class organizing the state, is to enhance the accumulation function. The state's responsibility is largely to ensure that capitalists can invest their money and make a sufficient amount of profit. That should sound familiar since it's the neoliberal mantra. Now, over on the right side, this legitimation function, let's suppose lots of organization of working class people using citizenship rights expands the social welfare state. Now, workers have access to means of subsistence. Remember, capitalists would like for workers to have nothing to sell but their labor power in order to survive. If workers can organize and receive benefits from the state, they are under less pressure to sell their labor power for a wage because they're receiving, maybe through some redistribution, some benefits that allows them to sit out of the marketplace, to sit out of the labor market. Now, I point out here, just follow the arrows, this reduces the size of the reserve army of labor. Remember, the capitalist class always wants there to be surplus, excess supply of workers, so that one worker can be easily replaced by another. You never want a tight labor market if you're a capitalist. Because if there's a tight labor market, workers can't be as easily replaced, and they can bargain for higher wages and benefits and better working conditions. But if a certain amount of workers can sort of sit out of the labor market, wait until they find the job they want, it makes it much more difficult, right? Now, what we mentioned was the expansion of the New Deal, where we did expand the social welfare state. This, at some point in the 1970s, created the supply side crisis, the capital strike. That produced, we talk more about this, there's lots of steps, I'm going through it quickly. Supply side crisis, how do you solve the supply side crisis? Under Reagan, and then continuing through every administration since, we have the neoliberal model, the neoliberal social structure of accumulation. And we indicated that the legitimation function, which at one time was social welfare, is now basically, what is legitimate? What is legitimate is anything that the state can do to enhance the ability of capitalists to make a profit. That becomes the only legitimate role for government. And if government's going to play any role at all, it's always in a public-private partnership. Okay, so trying to do in this diagram is take this issue of democracy versus capitalism, utilizing some of the concepts, some of the things we've done through the semester to bring it back together. When you finish this course, ideally you will have a narrative about how we got where we are today and the role of the political economic dynamics, particularly of neoliberalism, responsible for getting us to this, what I'll say, utterly dystopian state. I haven't even commented on the crap that's taken place over the last 2 weeks. That would be a 2-hour lecture, minimum. Okay. I'm not sure why that arrow is. Okay, that arrow shouldn't be. Okay. All right. I'm looking at the slide. There is an arrow that is over the rights, the property rights. That should be pointing down toward corporations as people. Okay. So one of the things that makes Bowles and Gintis's analysis so interesting and so fascinating and so insightful is that what they say is that the working class wants to take their citizenship rights and transport them into the economic sphere of capitalism. And think about this logically. The capitalist class wants to take property rights and translate that into the political system. In other words, if you're a capitalist, you don't want your power exclusively to reside in the economy. You want to be able to translate, and as we know, this is definitely the case, you want to translate your economic power, your property rights, into the political system. And this is, if we think about the constant conflict and clash between the capitalist class and the working class, the corporate elite and the majority, it revolves around working through the state to get citizenship rights transported into the workplace, to the economic sphere, and if you're a capitalist, property rights transported into the political system. So I'm giving a couple examples here. One thing recently were a number of Supreme Court decisions, and the most notorious is the Citizens United decision, which basically said that corporations are people. Now think about this. Corporations are citizens. This is a clear example. This is probably the clearest example of what Bowles and Gintis were talking about when they wrote their book 30 years ago. Property rights translated into citizenship rights. The Citizens United decision essentially said that corporations are people. Corporations have constitutional rights and freedom of expression. And what that means is they can spend as much money as they want on politics, candidates, political parties, PACs, as we call them, the political action committees. That is the successful transportation of property rights into citizenship rights, into the political system. I said before, citizenship rights, one person, one vote. Property rights, $1, one vote. Now, what about the working class? What do they want to do? How do they want to transport citizenship rights into the economic sphere? Right? Well, if you battle and fight for the minimum wage, now the wage that you're paid, at least the floor below it cannot fall, is not determined by the market. It's not market justice. It's social justice. Understand? So you've organized, lobbied the state intervenes, and it puts in place a policy, minimum wage policy, as horrible and crappy as it is in the United States. It puts that in place, and that obviously impacts the economic sphere, the marketplace. The market is no longer the determinant of wages, at least the floor below which wages can't go. Another example would be for workers to organize to ensure that they would organize. Right? They would demand politically from the state the right to form a labor union. And that is the ability for them to exercise some level of democratic rights, citizenship rights, in the workplace. All right. So I want you to think about this in terms of the conflicts and the battles that take place in a political economic environment of capitalism, of neoliberal capitalism, and the effort, you might say citizenship rights, social justice, property rights, market justice, and trying to transport the rights that originally exist in the polity into the economy, that originally exist in the economy into the polity. This is an amazing, fabulous insight of Bowles and Gintis, and you see it played out all the time. Okay, social citizen's wage, as I said before, the social citizen's wage, this is money you receive independent of working, independent of selling your labor power for a wage. It basically means the decommodification of labor. If labor is a commodity, what it receives, its value, is based on its sale, so to speak, in a labor market. All of you are going to the university because you want to enhance your labor market value. You know you're going to be a commodity. You know you're going to be selling your labor power for a wage. You just want to make sure that you have certain kinds of credentials and individual attributes which enhance your value in the market. The argument for a universal basic income is a form of decommodification of labor. Everyone will receive $15,000 or $30,000 a year without working. That's it. From the government. Okay. All right. This does violate the dual separation. Dual separation is something that Marx made reference to. The dual separation, that is, the government and the economy are separate, right? You remove government intervention and let the market decide. That's one form of separation. Okay. Government and market, you separate those two. The other form of separation is separation of individuals, humans, from independent means of subsistence. What does that mean? It means that under capitalism, you want to separate as many people as possible from access to property that would allow them to receive income, material needs would be met without having to sell their labor power for a wage, right? That's the whole idea. The whole idea of creating a proletariat and a working class is separating individuals from access to property that would allow them to live independent from relying upon a capitalist to hire them. And as I pointed out in the last diagram, the social citizen's wage represents the legitimation function under the O'Connor framework, and it is viewed as an impediment to the accumulation function. The greater the ability of individuals to survive without selling their labor power for a wage, the more difficult it is for capitalists to exploit workers. That's what I mean by impeding the accumulation function. All right, let's keep going. From property rights to citizenship rights, I'm just going to point this out quickly. A wonderful book if you're interested in this idea. What has been the history? And by the way, much of this has been accomplished through the courts. And there's a lot of attention now on the courts, the Supreme Court, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the nomination by Trump of somebody from the Federalist Society to take her place, and what that means, and how that might shape future decisions. And we talked about this on my podcast, me, Rick Phillips, and a faculty member from the university, Adrian Lerner. So you should check that out. This is a wonderful analysis historically of how corporations have essentially been able to define themselves as individuals that deserve the same constitutional rights as humans. Got it? Citizenship rights guaranteed by the Constitution, given to corporations. And how historically, over time, the business corporate community has been able to rack up victory after victory after victory through the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is a very undemocratic institution, and there's going to be a lot of debate about the composition of the court, whether it should be expanded, whether we should reduce the length of the terms of Supreme Court justices, because it has taken on a level of importance that is disproportionate. And that's an understatement. I mean, think about it this way. The replacement of one person, and if you read how people are talking about this, could shape and determine social and economic policy for decades, because it would provide a solid majority, conservative wing of the Supreme Court. Do we have any say in this? No. None. We have no say at all. So it's an undemocratic institution. It's not accountable. And it goes far beyond constitutional rights. It's obviously political. And the Democrats need to wake up and realize that. Stop pretending that it's a neutral arbiter making decisions purely on the basis of constitutional rights. So corporations have won all kinds of decisions. And I thought I would add this slide. The U.S. Supreme Court may soon become plutocracy's greatest defender. I would say that this has been the historical precedent of the Supreme Court as long as it's existed as an institution. The only exception might have been the Warren Court. You can do a little research on this if you're interested. And the Warren Court made some significant decisions that one would associate with social justice, but for the most part, the Supreme Court has been largely making decisions that serve the interests of the corporate elite, and there have been many recently. Okay, so this is somebody who's anticipating things getting even worse than they have been historically. This conflict between capitalism and democracy, I just wanted to take a quote from Peter Thiel. He's a billionaire, Silicon Valley billionaire, conservative, libertarian. And he's written a few pieces that I think really get at this. He's very honest and candid. He says, capitalism simply is not that popular with the crowd. Since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. Now, for Thiel, his concern is that capitalism is being influenced by democracy, and he doesn't like that because there are democratic decisions made by the majority of people who interfere with the marketplace that he thinks is sacrosanct. Limiting democracy isn't the same as limiting government, he says, and he's right about that. He understands that the state plays enormous role in ensuring that the market and corporations are as profitable as possible. And this is often done through what he says providing public goods. By public goods, he means roads, bridges, the necessary infrastructure. So this is part of the accumulation function. He doesn't use that terminology. But clearly his point is, he says, capitalist democracy is an oxymoron. He doesn't like democracy because it interferes with the market, and it interferes primarily, what he's pointing out, it interferes with property rights. So this is a clear expression, candid expression by a capitalist of why he does not like democracy. Okay, you've read, hopefully, Eric Olin Wright's piece on capitalism and freedom. In prior semesters, students have really liked this piece. And I'm just highlighting a couple things that it discusses. Human self-determination, which is freedom. To what extent do people really have freedom, self-determination under a capitalist economy? He obviously makes a case implicitly for participatory democracy when he talks about how capitalists are the ones who decide whether to invest, to disinvest, to shut down a factory. That decision is a property right. This is another example of how we can utilize Bowles and Ginter's model. Capitalist says, I'm going to close this factory. It's not profitable enough. Well, that's a decision that's affecting thousands of people, typically. Could be tens of thousands of people if it's an entire corporate operation. Do those people have any opportunity to participate in the decision about whether the factory is going to be closed? No. Right. Because citizenship rights have not been effectively transported into the corporate decision-making process. And in our society, nobody even thinks twice about this. Well, it's, the capitalist owns a corporation. It's their property. They should be able to do whatever they want with it. And there should be no limit on that, regardless of how many people it negatively affects. That's the market. That's market justice. Social justice would be considering all the stakeholders, all the people impacted and affected by that decision, and what role they should play. Now, in Eric Olin Wright's piece, when he makes this distinction between the public and the private sphere, to a large extent, he's talking about public democracy, private capitalism. Public citizenship rights, private property rights. And he talks about the constraints that indicate that, in fact, capitalism does not promote freedom. And that has always been one of the arguments that people make in support of capitalism. Freedom and liberty are promoted, free to choose, as Milton Friedman said. Okay, so hopefully you were able to extract some of the great insights from that piece. Now, Merkel focuses on a few similar things, but there's one particular area that Merkel discusses that we haven't given sufficient attention to in this class, but it's vitally important. So what I'm going to do is, because we're going on, let's see, about 53 minutes, and I need something for my throat, I'm going to take a break here, and we'll have a short part 2 to complete this week's lecture. I'll see you on the other side.